"You sure you're in the right place, old-timer?" The voice was young, sharp, and laced with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from being very good at something very dangerous. It cut through the low murmur of the bar, the clinking of glasses, and the distant drone of a sports recap on the television. Gordon Hughes, 81 years old, didn't turn his head. He kept his gaze fixed on the dark amber of the whiskey in his glass, the condensation tracing a slow path down the side. His hands, gnarled with age and speckled with liver spots, were steady around the tumbler. He had a slight permanent limp from a hip that never quite set right, and a hearing aid was nestled discreetly in his right ear. To the world, he was just another old man nursing a drink at the end of a long day in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood bar. The young man who had spoken, lean and coiled with muscle under a plain gray t-shirt, took Gordon's silence as an invitation to press on. He and his 4 friends had taken over a nearby booth, their energy too large and restless for the sleepy establishment. They were all in their late 20s or early 30s, with the close-cropped hair, neatly trimmed beards, and watchful eyes that marked them as something other than civilians. They were off-duty, dressed in jeans and casual shirts, but they carried an invisible uniform of discipline and confidence. They were Delta Force operators, though no sign on them would ever say so. "I'm serious," the man said, sliding onto the stool next to Gordon. His name was Jake. "This isn't exactly the VFW. You look a little lost." Gordon finally turned his head, his pale blue eyes taking in the younger man. They were eyes that had seen too much sun, too much darkness, and held a weariness that went deeper than bone. He offered a small, non-committal shrug, "Just having a drink." Jake's friends chuckled from their booth. They were enjoying the show. Their leader was bored and a little drunk, and he'd found a target for his amusement. Jake's eyes fell on the jacket Gordon had draped over the back of his stool. It was an old, faded field jacket, the kind you might find in a surplus store. On the sleeve was a patch, so worn and frayed that its design was nearly indecipherable. It was a dark, circular shape with what might have been a stylized skull or some kind of winged creature. Jake pointed at it with a smirk. "What's that supposed to be? You picked that up at a flea market, trying to impress the ladies." Gordon's expression didn't change. He simply reached over and pulled the jacket closer to him, a gesture of quiet possession. "It's just an old patch," he said, his voice a low rumble. This was the wrong answer. For men like Jake, men who had bled for the insignia on their own uniforms, even the unofficial ones, the idea of someone faking it was a profound insult. The suspicion of stolen valor, even in jest, was like a spark on dry tinder. The mood shifted from casual mockery to something harder. "An old patch," Jake repeated, his voice losing its playful edge. "What unit?" "It was a long time ago," Gordon said, turning back to his drink. He hoped the conversation would die. He hadn't come here for this. He never came for this. He just wanted the quiet, the familiar scent of stale beer and old wood, the anonymity. But Jake and his team were a force of nature. They were trained to probe weaknesses, to press until they got a reaction. Gordon's evasiveness was a red flag. One of the other operators, a broad-shouldered man named Coyle, left the booth and came to stand on the other side of Jake. "He doesn't want to talk about it, Jake," Coyle said, but there was a grin on his face. "Maybe it's top secret." The sarcasm was thick. "Is that it, old man?" Jake leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "You part of some super-secret squirrel club? Tell us a war story. We're all friends here." The bartender, a woman named Maria who had owned the place for 20 years, shot a worried glance from down the bar. She had seen Gordon come in 3 nights a week, regular as clockwork, for the better part of a decade. He always took the same stool, ordered the same whiskey, and never bothered a soul. She knew he was a veteran, but he never spoke of it. She also recognized the coiled energy of the younger men. She'd seen it before in soldiers on leave from the nearby base. It was a dangerous energy, a mix of pride and trauma and restless power that could easily boil over. Jake wasn't letting go. He saw the faded outline of a combat infantryman badge above the jacket's pocket. He saw the way Gordon carried himself, a stillness that was different from an ordinary old man's slowness. It was an economy of motion. Part of him was genuinely curious, but the dominant part, fueled by whiskey and ego, wanted to expose a fraud. "Look," Jake said, his patience finally gone. He jabbed a finger toward the patch again. "I'm not asking for state secrets, but men I know, better men than you or me, have died for the patches they wore. So when I see some old-timer in a bar wearing a piece of flair he can't identify, it pisses me off. So one more time, what unit?" The other operators were now all standing, forming a loose, intimidating semicircle around Gordon's stool. The other patrons in the bar were starting to notice. Conversations faltered. People shifted in their seats, pretending not to watch, but every eye was on the confrontation brewing at the bar. Gordon looked from Jake's hardened face to the faces of his comrades. He saw their certainty, their judgment. He saw their youth. They were lions, proud and strong, and he was just an old man in their way. He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a gate rusting shut. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said softly. Jake scoffed. "That's what they all say." He gestured at the worn patch on Gordon's jacket, its threads barely holding the image together. "This thing is a joke." As his finger touched the frayed fabric, the world seemed to warp for a moment in Gordon's mind. The smell of whiskey and sawdust vanished, replaced by the hot metallic scent of blood and cordite. The low hum of the bar's cooler became the deafening thwump 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 of rotor blades beating against a dusty ink-black sky. He wasn't in a bar in North Carolina anymore. He was 25 years old, crammed into the back of a Black Hawk, the vibrating floor slick with something wet. A young man next to him, his face covered in grime and sweat, grinned through the chaos and slapped the brand-new patch on Gordon's shoulder. It was identical to the one on the jacket, but the colors were crisp and new under the dim red light of the cabin. The skull in the center seemed to stare back at him, a promise of what they were and what they were about to do. The memory was a flash, a single searing frame that lasted less than a second, but it left the taste of ash in his mouth. He blinked, and the bar came back into focus. Jake was still there, his hand on the jacket, his face a mask of smug certainty. Maria had seen enough. She'd been watching the whole exchange, her hands tightening on the towel she was using to wipe down the counter. She saw the men closing in, saw the look of profound weariness on Gordon's face. These young soldiers, for all their power, had no idea what they were doing. They were like children playing with a landmine. She gave them one last pleading look, which they ignored, their focus entirely on the old man. With a grim set to her jaw, Maria turned and walked quietly to the small office behind the bar, closing the door behind her. The patrons might have thought she was calling the police, and a few of them looked relieved. But Maria wasn't dialing 911. The local cops wouldn't know how to handle this. This was something else. She opened a worn wooden drawer in her desk and pulled out a small laminated card. On it was a single phone number, written in black marker. A retired two-star general, a man who used to drink at this very bar, had given it to her years ago. "If Gordon ever has trouble he can't handle," the general had said, "and it's the kind of trouble a uniform understands, you call this number, don't ask questions, just call." She had never used it, until tonight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed. It rang twice before a clipped, professional voice answered. "Operations Center." "Hello," Maria said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "My name is Maria. I'm calling about a man named Gordon Hughes." She explained the situation quickly and clearly. The group of aggressive younger men who looked like soldiers, the cornering of an old disabled veteran, the growing tension. "I don't want any trouble," she finished. "But they're not listening. They won't leave him alone. They think he's a fake." "Gordon Hughes," the duty officer repeated, his tone professional but bored, likely expecting another crank call. "Understood, ma'am. Can you confirm the location?" Maria gave him the bar's address. There was a pause filled with the soft clicking of a keyboard. She waited, her heart pounding in the small, quiet office. She could still hear the muffled, angry voice of the young man in the bar, pressing, always pressing. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for a long 10 seconds. Then the officer's voice came back, and all the boredom was gone. It was replaced by an electrifying urgency, a tone of pure, unadulterated shock. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now a hushed, intense whisper. "Keep them there. Do not let them leave. Help is on the way." Inside the secure, windowless room of the Joint Special Operations Command Operations Center, Sergeant Miller stared at his monitor, his blood running cold. The name Gordon Hughes had flagged in the system with a level of clearance he had never seen before. It bypassed 5 levels of security protocols and brought up a single, heavily redacted file. Most of it was just black lines, but a few words shone through like beacons in the dark. Project Titan. Operation Nightshade. The Scythe of Kandahar. At the top of the file was a single stark warning in crimson letters. Incident of contact requires immediate notification to 06 level or higher. Do not engage. Do not detain. Sergeant Miller's hand was shaking as he picked up the direct line to his commanding officer's residence. He didn't care that it was almost 10 o'clock at night. The system was screaming at him. He was looking at a ghost, a name whispered in training but never spoken of in detail. A legend. And according to the woman on the phone, a handful of his own unit's hot-headed young operators were currently harassing that legend in a dive bar a few miles from the base. He swallowed hard. This was bad. This was very, very bad. Back in the bar, Jake was completely unaware of the storm gathering just over the horizon. He had crossed a line and felt the surge of power that came with it. Gordon's continued silence was, to him, a confession. He had him. The old fraud was cornered. "All right, that's it," Jake declared, his voice loud enough for the whole bar to hear. He grabbed Gordon's arm, his grip firm. Gordon didn't resist, but a flicker of something ancient and dangerous sparked in his tired eyes. "You and me, we're going to take a walk. We're going to go have a nice chat with the MPs, and they can figure out what kind of tall tales you've been spinning." He started to pull the old man off the stool. "Maybe a night in a cell will jog your memory. Or maybe we'll get you a nice psych evaluation. You seem confused." It was the ultimate humiliation. To be frog-marched out of his local bar, accused of being a liar and a madman, by a boy young enough to be his grandson. The other patrons gasped. Maria, who had just returned from the office, cried out, "Leave him alone." But Jake was committed. He was pulling Gordon to his feet, a triumphant sneer on his face. This was justice, in his mind. He was defending the honor of his brothers. At that exact moment, the front door of the bar swung open with a force that made the little bell above it jangle wildly. The sudden influx of cool night air silenced the room. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just 3 black immaculate SUVs that had pulled up to the curb with impossible silence. From the vehicles emerged 6 men. They were not in uniform. They wore dark, well-fitted civilian clothes, but they moved with a purpose and authority that was more potent than any uniform. They flowed into the bar, their eyes scanning the room once, assessing and dismissing every person there until they landed on the scene at the bar. Leading them was a tall man with short graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes, cold and clear, were fixed on Jake's hand gripping Gordon's arm. This was Colonel Williams, commander of the very unit Jake and his team belonged to. His presence sucked the air out of the room. Jake and his men instantly recognized him. Their bodies went rigid, the color draining from their faces. The triumphant sneer on Jake's face melted into an expression of pure, gut-wrenching dread. He let go of Gordon's arm as if it were red-hot iron. Colonel Williams ignored his own men completely. His focus was entirely on the old man they had been tormenting. He walked forward, his polished shoes making no sound on the dusty wooden floor, and stopped 3 feet in front of Gordon Hughes. The entire bar held its breath. Then, in an act that defied all logic for the onlookers, Colonel Williams snapped his body to the rigid, perfect posture of attention. He raised his right hand in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "Mr. Hughes," the colonel's voice was a low, clear tone that resonated with absolute respect. It filled every corner of the silent room. "Colonel David Williams, it is an honor, sir." Gordon slowly, painfully got to his feet. He looked at the colonel, a man of immense power saluting him in a dive bar, and gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. Williams held the salute for a moment longer before dropping his hand. He then turned his head, his icy gaze falling upon Jake and his 4 operators, who now looked like terrified schoolboys caught vandalizing the principal's office. "What?" the colonel asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "Do you think you are doing?" Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was speechless, his mind struggling to process the scene. The colonel of his elite unit was saluting a frail old man. It made no sense. "We thought, sir," Coyle stammered. "We thought he was a fake. Stolen valor." Colonel Williams took a slow step towards them, and all 5 men flinched. "You thought," he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You are paid to fight, to follow orders, and to be the smartest, most disciplined soldiers on this planet. You are not paid to think in a civilian establishment while harassing a citizen, and you certainly are not qualified to pass judgment on this man." He turned his body slightly, so his voice would carry through the bar, addressing not just his men but everyone present. "You see this man?" he said, gesturing to Gordon. "You see a quiet old man. You see a frayed jacket and a faded patch. Let me tell you what I see." He took a breath. "I see the man who held the northern flank at the Battle of Takur Gar for 17 hours, alone, after the rest of his team was wounded or killed. I see the man who went into Cambodia in 1971 on a mission so classified it was officially denied by 3 presidents. I see the man who designed the very close-quarters combat techniques that you," he stabbed a finger at Jake, "were taught in training, techniques that have saved your lives a dozen times over." The bar was utterly silent, save for the hum of the beer cooler. Jaws were slack. Maria stood with her hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "And this patch," the colonel said, his voice softening with reverence as he looked at the worn insignia on Gordon's jacket. "You see a joke. I see the symbol of MAC VSOG, a unit that officially never existed, A unit of ghosts who did the impossible in places they were never supposed to be. And within that unit he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. There was an even smaller, more select team, a hunter-killer element tasked with the most dangerous missions of the war. They were called Titan. There were only 4 of them. He looked directly at Gordon. Isn't that right, Titan 3? The name hung in the air, Titan 3. It meant nothing to the civilians, but to Jake and his men, it was as if the colonel had just invoked the name of a god. The legends, the ghost stories they told in hushed tones during training, they weren't just stories. One of them was standing right here. The quiet old man in the bar wasn't just a veteran. He was a foundational piece of the world they lived in. He was a monument, and they had tried to tear it down. Shame, hot and absolute, washed over them. Jake felt like he was going to be sick. He could not meet the colonel's eyes. He could not meet Gordon's. He stared at the floor, at his own boots, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Colonel Williams turned his back on them, a dismissal more profound than any punishment. He addressed Gordon softly. "I apologize for the behavior of my men, sir. It is unacceptable." Gordon finally spoke, his voice steady, devoid of anger or triumph. "They're young, Colonel. They're full of fire. I remember being like that." He looked over at Jake, whose head was still bowed in shame. "That fire is what makes them good at their job. You just have to teach them where to point it." He then looked down at his own hands, at the whiskey glass still on the bar. "The uniform, the patches, they don't matter in the end. It's about the man next to you. It's about getting him home. Everything else is just noise." He picked up his old jacket and gently ran a thumb over the frayed patch. The bar was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. The wisdom was simple, but coming from him, it carried the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice. As Gordon touched the patch, another image flickered behind his eyes, sharper this time. He was on his knees in a sweltering jungle, trying to stop the bleeding from his team leader's chest. The man, barely 28, was dying. With his last bit of strength, the leader had ripped the Titan patch from his own sleeve and pressed it into Gordon's hand. "You're the last one," he'd rasped, his voice choked with blood. "Don't let them forget us." It wasn't a badge of honor. It was a burden, a promise, a headstone for ghosts. Colonel Williams put a gentle hand on Gordon's shoulder. "Let us get you home, sir." He then turned to his aide. "Take care of his tab. For the next year." To his disgraced men he gave a single curt order. "My office, 0500. You are all on report." The fallout for Jake and his team was swift and severe. They were not discharged. The Army had invested too much in them for that. But they were humbled. They were pulled from operational status and assigned to a month of grueling remedial training. It wasn't about physical fitness or marksmanship. It was about history and humility. They spent their days in archives, reading the unredacted histories of units like Mac V So G. They spent their nights writing essays on the meaning of honor, respect, and the legacy they had inherited. They were forced to learn, in the most painful way, that they were just the latest chapter in a very long book, and they had insulted one of its authors. A week after the incident, a formal letter of apology from the base commander was delivered to Gordon's small, quiet house. It was accompanied by an offer for a lifetime of free medical care from the base hospital, an offer Gordon politely declined. He didn't want anything from them. He just wanted his quiet life back. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, Jake walked back into Maria's bar. He was alone and he was not in uniform, but he looked different. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a sober, thoughtful stillness. He saw Gordon sitting at his usual stool, staring into his usual glass of whiskey. Jake walked up to the bar slowly, keeping a respectful distance. Maria watched him, her expression wary. "Evening, sir," Jake said quietly. Gordon turned his head, his pale blue eyes regarding the young man. He saw the change. The fire was still there, but it was banked, controlled. Jake started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I came to apologize for my behavior, for my disrespect. There's no excuse for it, sir. I was wrong." Gordon looked at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the empty stool next to him. Jake hesitated, then sat down. "What's your name, son?" Gordon asked. "Jake, sir." Gordon motioned to Maria. "Get Jake here a drink, whatever he's having." He turned back to the young operator. "You learn anything from all this, Jake?" Jake stared into the polished surface of the bar. "I learned that the quietest man in the room is often the one worth listening to the most, and that some medals are carried in a man's memory, not on his chest." Gordon offered a rare, small smile. He raised his glass slightly. "That's a good start." They sat there for a while in comfortable silence. Two soldiers from different eras, bridged by a hard-learned lesson. The torch had not been passed, not yet. But for the first time, the young man had finally learned to see its light. Stories like Gordon Hughes's are a powerful reminder of the quiet heroes who walk among us. If you were moved by his story of valor and humility, please like this video, subscribe to Veteran Valor, and share it with others to ensure these legends are never forgotten.